All right, let's pop the hood on the US auto market because what's happening right now is a story of a massive, deep division. You've got these record setting winners on one side, and on the other, companies that are seriously teetering on the brink of disaster. And it's all happening inside a market that is absolutely not what it seems. Okay, so let's start with a number that is just genuinely shocking. In 2025, automakers sold 16.2 million new vehicles in the US. Sounds like a lot, right? Well, here's the kicker. That is the exact same number they sold 40 years ago, back in 1986. I mean, think about that. 4 decades. All the economic booms and busts, the tech revolutions, and the market has gone absolutely nowhere. And it gets even crazier when you layer this on top. Over those same 40 years, the US population grew by 21%. So you got way more people, but we're buying the same number of new cars. This isn't just stagnation, It's a real structural decline in how often people are buying new. It makes for an incredibly tough industry to compete in. So if the market is basically a frozen battlefield, how is anybody even surviving, let alone winning? Well, it turns out a few companies aren't just surviving, they are absolutely thriving. So let's take a look at who's actually in this winner's circle. First up, the titan itself, Toyota. In a market where finding any growth at all is almost impossible, Toyota somehow managed to pull off something incredible. They actually hit a new all-time sales peak in 2025. And just look at how tight this market really is. They sold 2.52 million vehicles, which just barely squeaked past their old record from 2015 by only 0.8%. I mean, in this kind of environment, even a tiny gain like that is a huge, monumental victory. Now, our second success story is even more dramatic. The combined force of Hyundai and Kia, well, they aren't just winning. They are on an absolute tear, just setting record after record. This is what explosive growth looks like in a market that's supposed to be flat. Their 2025 sales hit a record 1.63 million vehicles. That's a massive 26% higher than their last peak in 2015. They're not just growing, they're actively stealing market share at an incredible pace. But, this is a zero-sum game. For someone to win that big, somebody else has to lose. And the losers in this story, well, they aren't just having a bad year. They're facing what our source material calls an existential crisis. So our first case study here is Stellantis. This is the parent company of some of America's most iconic brands, right? We're talking Jeep, Ram, Chrysler, Dodge. Their sales chart is basically a horror story. Their sales have collapsed by 44% from their peak in 2015. Just let that sink in. They have lost almost half their business in a decade. That's not a slump. That is a complete freefall. And hey, that term freefall, that's not as being dramatic. The source for this explainer, the financial site Wolf Street, they put it in the starkest terms you can imagine, saying that for Stellantis, the death spiral continued. But Stellantis is not alone on this cliff edge. Another giant, Nissan, is looking at a frighteningly similar story. From their sales peak back in 2017, Nissan sales have plunged by 42%. So you have two major global automakers both down by over 40% from their recent highs. This is just a brutal, unforgiving market. Okay, so we've seen the winners and we've seen the companies that are pretty much flirting with catastrophe. But what about the legacy American and Japanese giants? They're not collapsing, but they are a long, long way from their glory days. Now, at first glance, this might look like pretty good news. GM, Ford, Honda, they all saw their sales go up a bit in 2025. But when you pull back and compare them to their past peaks, a totally different story emerges. GM is still down 7.5%. Honda is down 13%. And Ford is down a full 15% from its high. They're basically treading water, but that high water mark is just nowhere in sight. So this brings us to the big question. Why? Why is all this happening? What is separating the winners from the losers? Well, the clues all point to two really fundamental strategic decisions: the price of the car and the type of car being sold. First, let's talk about price. This timeline shows something pretty dramatic happened. Between early 2020 and the end of 2022, the average price people paid for a new car in the US just exploded. It shot up by 36%, and it's basically just stayed up there ever since, hovering right around $47,000. And this had a really direct impact on you, on the average buyer. The market pretty much slammed into an affordability ceiling. As Wolf Street puts it, the simple reality for millions of Americans is that new vehicles are now too expensive. And this connects right into that second clue, product.
With prices so high, affordability became everything. So take a look at Toyota. A full quarter of their sales, that's 620,000 vehicles, were sedans, cars like the Corolla and the Camry. These are the affordable, reliable cars that actually fit the budget of buyers who are totally priced out of the more expensive stuff.
Now, contrast that with the American automakers. I mean, what's the only car that Ford even sells in the US anymore? The Mustang. See, under pressure from Wall Street to chase those higher profit margins on big trucks and SUVs, companies like Ford and Stellantis just abandoned the massive sedan market. They basically handed it over to their competitors on a silver platter. So when you put all these pieces together, a market that's not growing, a price ceiling that people can't get past, and this huge strategic split on what to sell, you get the reality of the US auto industry today. It has become a brutal zero-sum game. All right, so let's just recap the key takeaways here. First, the overall market is just fundamentally stuck. Second, prices have hit a wall where people just can't afford them. Third, the winners are cleaning up by selling the exact cars, affordable sedans that the others gave up on. And finally, in a market like this, the only way you can grow is to take sales directly from your competition. And that really leaves us with one final and kind of chilling question. The battle lines are drawn. The winners are locking in their gains, and the losers are stuck in that death spiral. So in a brutal, zero-sum game with no room for error, who's going to be the next to fall?